You know, as of late, I find myself reminiscing about NFL players that I used to watch growing up through middle school and high school, and I thought it would be a really cool idea to formulate an all-decade team from the 2010s. So I'm just going to do it. I'm going to start with wide receivers. These are my top 10 wide receivers from the 2010s. Starting off at number 10, I have Michael Thomas. Now, I can understand people thinking that this is a questionable choice because he has wildly the shortest tenure here. It's not even close. But from 2016 to 2019, I don't know if a single receiver accomplished more than Michael Thomas did. It's insane. So obviously, he goes back-to-back first-team All-Pro in 2018 and 2019. But he's also the only receiver in this entire decade to win Offensive Player of the Year. I think to leave him off would be extremely disrespectful, and I think 10 is very fair given that his reign was very short-lived. But moving on, at number 9, I have Demaryius Thomas, and first of all, may he rest in peace. But second of all, there are only 3 players on this list to have had 10,000 yards during this decade. Demaryius Thomas was like this close to being the number 4 guy on that list. His career stretched through this entire decade. He was a second-team All-Pro player twice in 2013 and 2014, and he had 5 straight 1,000-yard seasons, including 2 that went for over 1,400 and 1 that went for over 1,600 yards. And again, he was this close to 10,000 yards. If he just gets a few more games with Peyton Manning, he's in that bracket. Now at number 8, I have Odell Beckham, and I know it hurts him a little bit, just like it did Michael Thomas, to have not gotten the entirety of this decade. But when Odell first came into the league, it was completely generational. It was groundbreaking to the point where he was on a record-setting pace, first of all, and he was basically the face of the entire NFL for 2 or 3 years. Like, if you were to think about the pace that Justin Jefferson is on right now, Odell was doing that 8 years ago, and that makes me feel old. But then on top of that, it was like him and Cam Newton that were 2 of the most influential players in the entire sport. So we can talk about the elite route running, how dominant he was on slants and taking those to the house. We can talk about the one-handed catch versus Dallas, but ultimately it's just a combination of how impactful he was on the field, but also how impactful he was off the field that I think puts him on this list. Then at number 7, I have Brandon Marshall, who was a first-team All-Pro player in 2012, over 1,500 yards and 11 touchdowns. He then led the league in touchdowns in 2015 with 14 total and had another 15-yard expedition that got him a second-team All-Pro bidding. This is another guy that had 5 seasons with over 1,000 yards, but none of this is nearly as impressive as how he did it. So Brandon Marshall spent most of his career with the Dolphins, the Bears, and the Jets. You know where I'm going with this. The Dolphins, for the 2 years that Brandon Marshall was there, had Chad Henne and Matt Moore as their quarterbacks. Then the Bears had Jay Cutler, and I know you're thinking, well, that's not so bad. He's pretty decent, but he missed substantial time for 2 out of Brandon Marshall's 3 years there, and he was forced to play with Josh McCown and Jason Campbell, both of which former Cleveland Browns legends, by the way. And if a quarterback was playing for the Browns in the 2010s, you probably didn't want them playing for you. Now, the Jets in 2015 did have that one really remarkable Ryan Fitzpatrick season, but as we all know, based on the Ryan Fitzpatrick cycle, it resulted in a really awful 2016 expedition. So across this entire decade, Brandon Marshall gets what? 2 seasons of quality quarterback play? That's ridiculous. It is beyond impressive that he was able to be as successful as he was as a receiver with the guys he had throwing him the football. But this is not meant to be a wide receiver slander video, so let's go ahead and move on to number 6 on this list, which is AJ Green. And this is the first of 2 wide receivers that just love to terrorize my Cleveland Browns twice a year. During this time, there were not many guys who were more difficult to guard, who gave DBs more trouble at the catch point than AJ Green. And I'm willing to bet that if he had been healthy for his entire career, we're easily putting this guy in the top 5, if not in the top 3 on this list. In the 8-year span from 2011 to 2018, AJ Green came up just 100 yards short of 9,000 total yards. I'm very confident that a healthy AJ Green, like Demaryius Thomas, is another guy that very easily could have broken that 10,000 yard threshold. And like I already said, he gave my Browns hell twice a year, every year. He terrorized us. I still get nightmares of the one-handed Hail Mary that he caught. He was just truly unfair in his prime. But so far we've talked about a lot of guys that have been really dominant at their peaks, but we haven't gotten to talk about a ton of consistency, and this is where I'm going to break that trend. At number 5, I'm going Larry Fitzgerald. Larry legend, baby. Larry is the first of 3 players on this list to have eclipsed 10,000 yards during this decade, and like I said, it's because he was consistently reliable, not because he was just purely dominant like AJ Green or Odell or Michael Thomas were. And because he wasn't breaking records and winning all these awards, I actually almost left him off this list entirely. But you look at guys like AJ Green and Demaryius Thomas, and you're like, man, if they could have just gotten that much closer, they could have had that 10,000 yard threshold. Larry Fitzgerald hit that because he was so reliable and so consistent. There was never any question of, oh, well, if he had had this, if he had had that, if he had stayed healthy, he had it all, right? You knew that you had Larry Fitzgerald week in, week out, and you knew that when you threw to him, you were going to get a completion more than likely. His spot on this list is well deserved, but we're going to move on through the rest of the top 5, as at number 4, I have DeAndre Hopkins. I think we're to the point on this list where no one's really going to be surprised with who the next 4 are. All of them at one point or another were considered to be the best receiver in the NFL. And given that D-Hop had 3 straight first-team All-Pros, I think he qualifies for that title. But getting down to the nitty-gritty of what made prime DeAndre Hopkins so special is this rare combination of what he offered as a route runner, tracking the football in the air, of course, all the way to his hands and making the catch, and then just the ability to be so smooth and making plays after the catch. He's a 6'1" receiver that moves like he's 5'10", but attacks the football at the catch point like he's 6'4". A receiver with that combination of skills is just so dangerous, and if he had played the entire decade, he would have well been into the top 3, I'm sure. But speaking of the top 3, we're right here, so we might as well talk about him. Number 3, I have Calvin Johnson, also known as Megatron. I know that at one point in the NFL, Calvin Johnson was deemed undoubtedly the best receiver in football. And I don't know if anyone is considered to be more unstoppable or physically imposing during this decade than Megatron was. We know he broke the all-time receiving record in 2012. That record still stands at 1,964 yards, although Cooper Kupp did come close to it in his Triple Crown year, but came just short. But just like DeAndre Hopkins, his tenure's just not long enough to be higher on this list. If he had not retired in 2015, we're making a strong case for him to be number 1, no doubt about it. Moving on, at number 2, I have Julio Jones, who was widely considered to be a top 3 receiver for most, if not all, of this decade. Everyone knows how dominant he was as a deep threat. He could terrorize you in ways that very few receivers could, but Panthers fans should know better than anyone what he can do after the catch, how he can take a short pass and take it to the crib. That 300-yard game, I know that still terrorizes you. Okay, I'm using the word terrorize too much. I'm gonna stop. I'm never using it again. Julio led the league in 2015 with nearly 1,900 receiving yards, and then he did it again in 2018 with nearly 1,700 yards. And you know, he never snagged a ton of touchdowns, but whenever someone has over 1,400 yards for 5 straight years and is either a first or second team All-Pro player for 5 straight years, there's a reason. And he's number 2 on this list for a reason. Now, before we get to number 1, who at this point you should all know who it is, but I do want to go over some honorable mentions, just guys who were on the verge of this list but didn't quite have the merit to get over the hump. I think it would be a mistake to talk about receivers from the 2010s without talking about Jordy Nelson. If there was a guy that was just like literally the one spot out, it would be him. Like, he would have been number 11 on this list. There's also Mike Evans, who I just don't think quite has the dominance that a lot of these guys do, although he does have the consistency with 1,000-yard seasons literally every year. And then Dez Bryant and T.Y. Hilton kind of have the opposite problem. Then, of course, at number 1, we have Antonio Brown. And as a Cleveland Browns fan, this one sucks for me. It really sucks. I had to watch this guy decimate my team twice a year, every year, for like most of middle and high school. It was brutal. But he was just great, and it felt like he was great at everything. And it wasn't even like he had this massive frame. He wasn't 6'4", he didn't run a 4.3. He was just a smooth mover, and it showed up in his punt returns, it showed up in his route running. Everything he did was near flawless. You look at a lot of the other guys on this list, Julio, Megatron, AJ Green, Odell, all had high athleticism, freakish skill sets, and then there's Antonio Brown, who's just like, yeah, I'm gonna go 4 straight first-team All-Pros. The one thing that does help me sleep at night, the little bit of solace that I do get, is the fact that with Big Ben, Antonio Brown, and Le'Veon Bell on offense, that Steelers team still couldn't win a Super Bowl. Thank God. I know I sound like a hater right now, but I am. I really didn't want to put Antonio Brown at number 1, but he deserves it. He was so good. And that wraps up my top 10 wide receivers from the 2010s. Let me know if you want me to do more position groups from this, or if you want me to just do more decades. But until then, thank you all so much for tuning in, and I will catch you on the flippity flop.